entitled to expect that next step? What do we have a right to expect of our intelligence community with regard to predicting time and place of a major terrorist attack? Ms. Tennant, I'll ask you first.
It is the most difficult thing to do, is have that date, time, and place of event. We have, you have to be able to take all of this data. You have to be able to then analytically assess a target set that it may be applied against. You have to go protect that target set, because the truth is there'll be dates and times and all kinds of information, and it'll never happen on the date and time. And then the date and time will elapse. And then people will basically say, I guess it's not going to happen. You have to expect us to tell you honestly, in strategic terms, this is where I think the sector of the attack is going to be. This is what I know their training and methodology has been. This is my best judgment about what you have to go protect. Go protect it. Now, in the overseas environment today, and it would be useful at some point to come out and sit down, there's a great deal of specificity overseas about places and times and events, and the pattern of racing to stop it has been pretty successful. You go back and look at this recent French tanker, and the reporting out there on the French tanker was 2 or 3 months old, but it was there. This is a place and a location that we are worried about commercial shipping and tanker traffic. And so you see, it stretches out over time. What we owe you always, and what we have to work harder to do, is our best strategic judgment about what the it is.
Some policymakers recognize that countering al-Qaeda required the application of all aspects of U.S. power. According to testimony from Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, the effort against al-Qaeda was, quote, is not just something for the intelligence community alone. You can't go to war against al-Qaeda without recognizing the role that the government of Afghanistan is playing. You can't go after the government of Afghanistan without recognizing the problems in your own relationship, particularly with Pakistan, but with other neighboring countries. And you can't get serious about this without looking at military options, end quote. Before September 11th, however, neither the Clinton nor Bush administration developed a plan to disrupt al-Qaeda that integrated U.S. diplomatic, economic, intelligence, and military assets. Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage testified that the Bush administration received briefings on the urgency of the al-Qaeda threat, but we were never given a plan, a contention Mr. Berger echoed. Paul Wolfowitz testified that even contingency planning for using the military for counterterrorism was in the very most primitive stages. General Hugh Shelton, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told the Joint Inquiry that he did not believe that policymakers had any serious plans to use the military in a significant way against the Taliban before September 11th. In the absence of a more comprehensive strategy, the United States defaulted to relying on law enforcement at home and abroad as the leading instrument in the fight against al-Qaeda. The perpetrators of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the plot against New York City landmarks, several co-conspirators and conspirators in the 1998 embassy bombings, and several members of a group that planned millennium attacks were all prosecuted. This emphasis on prosecution continued a trend which began in the 1980s when Congress and President Ronald Reagan gave the FBI an important role in countering international terrorism, including attacks overseas. Government officials apparently never intended to rely exclusively on law enforcement to fight terrorism. Senior Department of Justice officials testified that they saw their efforts as an adjunct to other means of fighting terrorism. Mary Jo White, who was a U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, prosecuted many of the most important cases against al-Qaeda and testified before the Joint Inquiry that no one considered prosecutions to be the country's counterterrorism strategy, or even a particularly major part of it. Paul Wolfowitz testified that terrorism is not a law enforcement problem, and it can't be dealt with simply by retaliating against individuals which are conducting acts of terrorism. However, covert action and military force had little impact before September 11th. Prosecutors do have several advantages in the fight against terrorism. As Mary Jo White noted in her testimony before the Joint Inquiry and in an interview prosecutions take terrorists off the streets. She acknowledged that this doesn't shut down an entire group, but some bombs, she said, they do not go off as a result of arrests. In addition, she pointed out that critical intelligence often comes from the investigative process, as individual terrorists confess or reveal associates through their personal effects and communications. As former FBI Director Louis Freeh asserted in an interview, you can't divorce arrest from prevention. Mary Jo White contended that the prosecutions might deter some, though not all individuals, from violence. Finally, the threat of a jail sentence often induces terrorists to cooperate with investigators and provide information. Heavy reliance on law enforcement, however, has costs. National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia, Paul Pillar, noted in joint inquiry testimony that it is easier to arrest terrorist underlings than masterminds. Those who organize and plan attacks, particularly the ultimate decision makers who authorize them, are often thousands of miles away when an attack is carried out. In addition, the deterrent effect of imprisonment is often minimal for highly motivated terrorists, such as those in Al Qaeda. Moreover, law enforcement is time consuming. The CIA and the FBI expanded considerable resources supporting investigations in Africa and in Yemen into the embassy and USS Cole attacks, a drain on scarce resources that could have been used to gather information and disrupt future attacks. Finally, law enforcement standards of evidence are high, and establishing a legal case that meets these standards often requires unattainable intelligence and threatens to compromise sensitive sources or methods. At times, law enforcement intelligence have competing interests. The former head of the FBI's International Terrorism Section noted that Attorney General Janet Reno leaned toward closing down surveillances under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act if they hindered criminal cases. In addition, convictions that help disrupt terrorists are often based on lesser charges, such as immigration violations, and this may not always convince FBI field personnel that the effort is even worthwhile compared with other cases that put criminals in jail for many years. As former FBI Assistant Director for Counterterrorism, Dale Watson explained to the joint inquiry, special agents in charge of FBI field offices focused more on convicting than on disrupting. Reliance on law enforcement when individuals have fled to a hostile country, such as Iran or the Taliban's Afghanistan, appears particularly ineffective, as the masterminds are often beyond the reach of justice. One FBI agent scorned the idea of using the Bureau to take the lead in countering Al Qaeda, noting that all the FBI can do is arrest and prosecute. It cannot shut down training camps in hostile countries. He noted that the strategy is like telling the FBI after Pearl Harbor, go to Tokyo and arrest the emperor. In his opinion, a military solution was necessary because the Southern District doesn't have any cruise missiles.